James E. Talmage was born in Hungerford, England. He was ordained an apostle December 8, 1911. Previous to his call to the Council of the 12, he was a distinguished geologist and writer. His classics were written both before and after his call. Articles of Faith, Jesus the Christ, The Story of Mormonism, The Philosophy of Mormonism, The Great Apostasy, and The Vitality of Mormonism. His parables were posthumously gathered from among his many sermons.
Well, long before their call as members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, James E. Talmage and John A. Widsoe were well known as classic scientists. They had studied, and their works were well received in the academic community. Brother Talmage himself was also a great administrator. He moved from teaching at the University of Utah to teaching at the Utah State University. It was a different name at that time. And then he went back to the University of Utah and served as president, then went and served at Utah State University as president. And all this time he had worked on a set of lectures that would eventually become the Articles of Faith, and he had to put that aside because he was doing all this other work. Eventually, at the time of his call to the apostleship, he was assigned to return to that project and other projects. But he was an incredible lecturer. He was just a fabulous orator.
And you know, he looks like a scientist, doesn't he? He looks like the kind of man that would be a serious science teacher, yeah. and yet contributed important things to the church. I think members of the church know well Jesus the Christ and the Articles of Faith, but I'm excited that we're making available some less well-known things. You know, the Vitality of Mormonism, the Story and Philosophy of Mormonism. What's he doing there? What are those little books talking about?
Well, they're the practical side of the gospel and answers to gospel questions of that era.
Okay. Yeah, I find it him one at turning point, that movement into the 20th century again, where those leaders of the church are trying so hard to say to the world, we're different than you, but you ought to pay attention to us. We've got something to offer. You know, Mormonism's worthwhile.
You know, as a religious educator myself, I appreciate Talmage's parables. We know of the great works and Jesus the Christ, Articles of Faith, and even the Vitality of Mormonism, but there's little parables that he used that we continue to use and hear in talks. I love that he could take an important gospel principle and then use a parable from science, from life, from botany or other kinds of things, and then teach that important gospel principle. For example, I love the parable of the unwise bee. Do you remember how he was trying to help the bee to leave the room at the Salt Lake Temple, and then the bee stings him, and he uses it as an example of how so often our Heavenly Father is trying to help us, and we think that he's harming us, and that we then sting him and are left to our demise sometimes because we reject the Lord's help. And little parables like that Elder Talmage uses that are not very familiar to Latter-day Saints, but are so good at teaching a very important principle.
And show you a dimension of Elder Talmage
right.
that you wouldn't see with some of his other
right.
more difficult
that are more
writings.
lofty and intellectual
yeah.
and academic in ways.
Two books, you know, that you can think of that Talmage wrote, jaw-breaking words all over the place. Mm-hmm. I mean, people have written dictionaries just so that you can understand Talmage's books. Well, and yet...
And the parables.
But the parables are things that are eminently accessible.
Yeah, down to earth.
I think that it's really quite significant to go back to where we started and to recognize that oftentimes the works that we recognize the name and we've kind of enshrined were written before they held office or position. That's an important lesson to every Latter-day Saint, you see. You can write, you can think, you can know, you can understand.
And you don't have to hold
And
major
you
church
don't- and
office.
you don't
The
have-
Spirit still directs you.
Yeah, it's not an office. Knowledge is not an office. Understanding is not an office, you see. And I wouldn't suppose for a moment that they had an aspiration for office. I don't think that motivated their writing. I think it was a keen desire to know and understand, and they're both born teachers and love to teach. And in that day, a lecture was a much more formal kind of
Oh,
thing,
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
it? And so you prepared it in detail, and so it flows into book form very naturally. But I think there's just a great lesson there.
I mean, year after year, Talmage would go to Europe and give a series of lectures, and it was the expectation of people, not just in the church, but they just expected him to be there. By assignment of the first presidency, after an individual had found his way into the Salt Lake Temple and took photographs all throughout the building, and was going to publish and was actually trying to hold the church hostage to it. And of course, the church was not even going to respond to that, except that they asked Brother Talmage to write a book called The House of the Lord. And there was an opportunity at that time for the church to express in appropriate terms the beauties and majesty of what is bestowed by the blessings of the house of the Lord. And it being quoted even in our generation shows you that these voices, though raised up maybe a generation apart, nonetheless they did have something that is timeless too.
Well prepared. Well prepared.